You already know what an AK-47 is. You might also know it's the most produced weapon in human history. However, what you don't know, and what most fans of this rifle would probably rather not know, is where this rifle came from, where it actually ended up, and what it has done across 75 years of human history. You'll see why it was better if you never found out. Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov was the 17th of 19 children born to peasant parents, though only 8 of those children would survive to adulthood. His young life was more than difficult. He was deported to Siberia during the politically turbulent years, all while he dreamt about designing agricultural machines. But then the Second World War started, and he was drafted into the Soviet army. In 1941, he was actually a senior sergeant tank commander, and during the Battle of Bryansk, his tank was hit by a German anti-tank gun, seriously wounding the future designer of the gun that would change the world. He went on to spend 6 months recovering in hospital, and it was actually there where the story of what would become the AK-47 began. You see, he was listening to Soviet soldiers complaining about their rifles, how they were inferior to the well-made German ones, and he was determined to do something about it. Kalashnikov had already shown mechanical talent before this, designing some gadgets for the tanks, and the army took notice of him and gave him a chance to work as a designer. Now, to understand what Kalashnikov was trying to create, you have to understand what the Germans had already figured out. The Sturmgewehr 44, or STG-44, was the world's first truly successful assault rifle, and it represented something revolutionary in firearms design. Before the STG-44, militaries were using rifles in full-power cartridges as the main armament, while machine guns, submachine guns, and carbines filled in the gaps between the rate of fire and stopping power. But here's the thing. Data from the war showed that most firefights actually took place under 300 meters, and within this radius, the full-power rifle cartridges that are effective to over a kilometer were simply overkill. And it wasn't the overkill itself that bothered them, but the amount of ammunition a soldier was limited to carry, the cost of production, and how a weapon firing a larger round is heavier and more difficult to shoot rapidly due to recoil. Submachine guns went in the opposite direction, but they also went too far. They were chambered in pistol calibers, and although great for clearing trenches and houses, they weren't really effective beyond 50 meters, let alone over 100, with not so great stopping power either. So, the idea was this. If everyone would have the same rifle in the same caliber, one that was good to fight within a radius of 300 meters, offered accurate single shots while also fully automatic fire if needed, the soldier could carry more rounds than for the full-power rifles. This concept would become known as the intermediate cartridge, something that bridges the gap between pistol-chambered submachine guns and the bolt-action or semi-auto rifles of the time. And the Germans were among the first to figure it out with their 7.92 by 33mm round, and then the STG-44 rifle built around it. It was the first true assault rifle as we know it today. It fired accurate, effective shots. It had a 30-round magazine and could fire quite controllable full auto bursts, while soldiers could carry a couple hundred rounds without breaking their backs. The Germans came up with it too late to make any difference in the outcome of the war, as they were already collapsing on all fronts when the Sturmgewehrs came in any significant numbers. Also, you can watch our whole video on it after this one if you want. The Soviets had already captured these new rifles and were quite interested in the cartridge, so they began developing something similar. This something similar would become the 7.62 by 39mm. But during the difficult wartime years, and with focus on production of the weapons they already had, there wasn't much space to create a new weapon around this caliber, but it was kept close by. The Americans were trying the same thing with their M1 carbine, which was the somewhat downsized 30-06 and M1 Garand. But the cartridge didn't prove to be too great, so it was soon more or less abandoned. The Germans had actually hit that sweet spot exactly, and it didn't go unnoticed by the countries that stole all their technology after beating them in war. However, they didn't steal just the weapons and blueprints. In Operation Osoaviakhim in 1946, in the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, in the middle of the night, Soviet forces simultaneously raided the homes of over 2,000 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. They were politely told to pack what they could and that they were now moving to the Soviet Union along with their families, which the Germans kindly accepted, as the alternative option wasn't quite prosperous, if you know what I mean. Hugo Schmeisser, the designer of the STG-44 and many other German weapons, was one of the most important people the Soviets took. He was brought to the main Soviet small arms manufacturing center, where he remained until June 9, 1952, when he was finally allowed to return to Germany. He died about a year later. But how much he had a part in developing what would become the AK-47 during his voluntary time in the Soviet Union, we will never know. So, The question of whether the AK-47 copied the STG-44 really comes down to the operating mechanism, and when you look closely, the differences become obvious. The STG-44 works in a fundamentally different way from what Kalashnikov designed. However, we can all agree that there was some quote-unquote inspiration from it when you simply look at these two rifles from the outside. As for the inside, the AK's rotating bolt system actually has more in common with the American M1 Garand than with the German STG-44, and Kalashnikov himself acknowledged that he combined the best features of multiple designs. So, to not bore you with the complicated competition of 7 different prototypes and different engineers and who did what, in short, it looked like this. Kalashnikov's rifle was already performing better than competitors in trials. Then came Alexander Zaitsev with the idea to replace the gas piston and bolt carrier to make them move together as one unit. This would create massive momentum that could overcome fouling or debris, hinting at the incredible reliability that would come with it, along with some other smaller adjustments. The new prototypes that got these changes became the true AK-47s, adopted in 1948 as Avtomat Kalashnikova, or simply the AK. Now, what actually makes the AK so reliable? Well, while most precision rifles have parts machined to fit together tightly, Kalashnikov went the opposite direction. It has intentionally loose tolerances with generous clearances between moving parts. This means that when dirt, mud, sand, or debris gets into the weapon, which it inevitably will in combat, that material has room to move around inside the action without seizing everything up. The trade-off is slightly reduced accuracy compared to tighter tolerance weapons. But in a battle rifle meant for conscript armies, reliability matters far more than target shooting precision. Then there's the long-stroke gas piston system we mentioned, that design improvement that made the AK what it is. When you fire the AK-47, hot gases from the burning propellant are diverted through a port near the muzzle into a gas cylinder above the barrel. These gases push against a piston that's directly connected to the bolt carrier. The system's stroke is actually 50% longer than necessary, which means the weapon often functions even when impeded by fouling, dirt, or complete lack of lubrication. The moving assembly also has about 5.5 millimeters of free travel, creating a delay between the initial recoil impulse of the piston and the bolt unlocking sequence, giving gas pressures time to drop to safe levels before the seal between chamber and bolt is broken. The chrome-lined barrel and chamber resist corrosion and wear, which is critical for harsh field conditions and especially important when using corrosively primed Eastern Bloc ammunition. Chrome-lined barrels can last 15,000 to 20,000 rounds or more. And one of the key features of the 7.62 by 39mm cartridge was its highly tapered case. It was specifically designed to ensure reliable feeding and extraction in automatic weapons. When you load cartridges into a magazine and then strip them out during firing, that taper creates minimal contact with the chamber walls, which means fewer jams. This tapered case is also why AK magazines have that distinctive curved shape that everyone recognizes. So, early AK-47s used heavy milled receivers because stamped sheet metal production was not yet reliable at the time. But once that problem was solved, the Soviets introduced the AKM, which used a stamped receiver, was lighter, cheaper to produce, and included several small improvements. In everyday speech, people still call it an AK-47, but technically most of the rifles people think of as AK-47s are actually AKMs. It also introduced the distinctive slant muzzle brake, nicknamed the whistle by Soviet troops. The brake vented propellant gases upward and slightly to the right. You see, the rifle naturally tended to climb and twist in that direction during automatic fire because of recoil and the way the barrel was rifled, so pushing gases the opposite way helped keep the muzzle down and made the weapon easier to control. But more importantly, the AKM enabled massive production volumes and made it far easier for other countries to produce their own versions, whether licensed or otherwise. The AKM became the basis for virtually all subsequent AK development, and the final product was ready for mass production. And when I say mass production, I mean that it went eventually to an estimated 100 million units produced of various versions. No other rifle comes even close to this number. However, this is where things start getting dark. The Soviets decided to spread AK-47 manufacturing technology without licensing fees as a strategic geopolitical tool, giving it freely to Warsaw Pact allies and developing nations seeking Soviet support. This resulted in that staggering number of AKs produced, and also made it easy to get into the hands of some quote-unquote questionable organizations. Over 200 different types have been produced in at least 30 countries. Vietnam became the first major test for the AK-47 against American forces, and it also exposed serious problems with America's own new rifle. The first AK variants outperformed everything in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces relied heavily on weapons and equipment supplied by the Soviet Union and China. Meanwhile, the American M16 was experiencing a reliability crisis that became a national scandal. Approximately 80% of US troops early in the war reported experiencing stoppage issues with their rifles, and many of them got killed because of it. If you're a weapons and history nerd, you probably know what happened and why. If not, we also have a video on that as well that you can check out later. It went so bad that some American troops began purchasing Chinese Type 56 rifles through underground markets. The M16 eventually solved its problems, but only after many soldiers carrying it into combat had already died. By then, Vietnam had established the AK-47's reputation as the reliable rifle that kept working in all conditions. And while Vietnam made the AK-47 famous, Afghanistan showed the real horrors. In one of history's great ironies, the United States became one of the largest purchasers of Kalashnikov rifles, which later backfired on them. Operation Cyclone became one of the longest and most expensive covert CIA operations ever undertaken. The goal was to arm the Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Soviet invasion, and the funding escalated dramatically over the years until the program had reached $630 million. The idea was to support the Afghan fighters to kill as many Soviet soldiers as they could, and because shipping them M16s would be too obvious proving American involvement, they chose to buy the Chinese, Egyptian, and Turkish AK variants instead. However, the long-term consequences proved devastating. Those weapons didn't disappear when the Soviets withdrew. Afghanistan became a heavily armed, militarized society. The Mujahideen factions, armed to the teeth with American-purchased weapons, eventually splintered. Out of that mess, years later came the Taliban, that were now armed by the very same weapons they had plenty of, given by none other than the American CIA. So, when the US went back to Afghanistan after 2001, American soldiers were fighting against a force armed coincidentally by their own country. Just a great use of our tax money. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the floodgates opened. Massive arms surpluses poured out from former Soviet republics. Economically strapped residents of the former Soviet states sold abandoned military hardware to scrap yards for whatever cash they could get. The same thing happened with the dissolution of Yugoslavia, which had also been producing millions of units of their AK variant. These weapons kept finding their way to terrorism and all sorts of organizations around the world. And if your organization needs assault rifles for some reason, it gives off the vibe that it wasn't built with particularly charitable intentions toward other people. In places where demand is high and supply plentiful, AKs could be found for laughable prices. During the Rwandan Civil War, it was said that you could buy an AK-47 for the price of one chicken. The illegal arms trade centered on AK-47s is estimated to be worth several $1 billion annually. But look at this even more strange data. In South Africa, the situation has become so bizarre that criminals don't even need to buy the weapons. They can rent them. A 2024 investigation revealed a growing trend where smaller criminal gangs hire assault rifles from larger syndicates for a day, a week, or a month, and they were notoriously used in cash-in-transit heists to ambush armored vehicles on major highways. If you really want to spook yourself with the real horrors around the AK, go and look up Child Soldiers of Africa, although I don't recommend it. The weapon became a symbol in itself, so much so that Mozambique even put it on their national flag, the only country in the world with a modern assault rifle as part of their official emblem. But the AK platform didn't stop evolving after Kalashnikov's original design. In 1974, the Soviets introduced the AK-74, chambered for a new cartridge that would earn its own terrible reputation. They wanted a smaller, faster, lighter round with better terminal ballistics, and the 5.45x39 delivered exactly that. The cartridge offered flatter trajectory and less recoil than the 7.62 by 39mm, and soldiers could engage targets more accurately at range thanks to the higher muzzle velocity, around 920 meters per second compared to 735 meters per second for the older round. Tests showed the free recoil energy of the AK-74 was just 3.39 joules, compared to 7.19 joules from the AK-47. The rifle kept the same basic operating system as its predecessor, so anyone familiar with the AK could pick it up and use it immediately. But when the AK-74 saw service during the Soviet-Afghan War, the original 5.45 by 39 ball round quickly earned a terrifying nickname. The Afghan Mujahideen called it the poison bullet. The reason was the wound characteristics. The bullet had a gilding metal-clad copper jacket with a hollow airspace at the nose and an unhardened steel rod penetrator core. That airspace shifted the bullet's center of gravity rearward, making the point prone to deformation on impact. When the bullet hit flesh, it would begin to yaw and tumble within the first 10 centimeters of penetration, creating wound channels that were dramatically worse than what the older 7.62 round produced. The wounds were devastating, but the poison reputation came from something else entirely. Wounded fighters, often left untreated for days due to severe shortage of antibiotics in Afghanistan, quickly developed infections and gangrene. They genuinely believed the Soviets had poisoned the bullets. The bullet's tendency to ricochet and fragment inside targets promoted contamination of the wound channel with dirt, which only made everything worse. The CIA even paid $5,000 to the Mujahideen for the first AK-74 captured during the war, because American intelligence wanted to study the Soviets' new rifle and its terrifying new cartridge. The platform has continued evolving through multiple generations since then. The AK-100 series offered the design in multiple calibers, including 5.56 NATO, 7.62 by 39, and 5.45 by 39, basically making it adaptable to whatever ammunition a country preferred or had access to. The AK-12 is Russia's current standard issue rifle, officially adopted in January 2018. And the AK platform also spawned a family of light machine guns using the same operating system. The RPK essentially stretched the AK design with a longer, heavier barrel, a reinforced receiver, and larger magazines holding 40 or 75 rounds, giving squads automatic fire support with a weapon their soldiers already knew how to use. Serbia's Zastava has pushed the AK platform in an interesting new direction with the M17 rifle. It represents the first military adoption of the 6.5mm Grendel cartridge, or their proprietary 6.5 by 38 variant. The 6.5 Grendel offers ballistic advantages over both the 5.45 by 39 and 5.56 NATO, with better long-range performance and terminal effectiveness while still being controllable in automatic fire. So, even now, nearly 80 years after Kalashnikov began sketching ideas in that hospital bed, his basic design continues to be adapted and improved. But what did all of this mean for the man who created it? The rifle, Mikhail Kalashnikov, designed to protect the Soviet motherland, became the deadliest small arm in human history. The commonly cited figure is that AK-47s kill approximately 250,000 people per year. I don't know how accurate this number is, but that's what it says. For most of his life, Mikhail Kalashnikov defended his creation, saying that it wasn't his design that was killing so many people around the world, but the politicians that are manipulating the organizations and armies that use them. But it eventually went far beyond anything he could even imagine. Over time, through his several statements, we could see how he was slowly changing his thinking. In 2002, he said, "I'm proud of my invention, but I'm sad that it is used by terrorists." But then in April 2012, at age 91, Kalashnikov wrote a letter to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was only published after his death. He wrote, quote, "My spiritual pain is unbearable. I keep having the same unsolved question. If my rifle took away people's lives, then can it be that I, Mikhail Kalashnikov, am guilty for people's deaths?" Whether Kalashnikov found comfort in the response, we would never know. He died less than 2 years later at age 94, and a final salute was fired from AK-47 rifles.